When my wife and I decided to spend the summer at my old cabin in the mountains, I figured the only drama we'd face would be from the occasional bear sniffing around the trash cans. The cabin had been in my family for decades, built by my grandfather with his own hands, and I'd always considered it a place to get away from the noise of the city. Unfortunately, the noise found a way to follow us in the form of the local homeowners association president, a woman named Sharon, though everyone around here quietly called her Karen, for obvious reasons. I had heard stories about her patrolling the neighborhood in her golf cart, clipboard in hand, reporting everything from mismatched curtains to unauthorized bird feeders. But I figured she'd have no reason to bother with us. I was wrong. The trouble started the day my wife arrived. She had been overseas for her military deployment and was finally coming home. We drove up together in my truck, parked in the gravel driveway, and started unloading her bags. That's when I noticed the golf cart creeping toward us like a shark in the water. Sharon, or Karen, as my neighbors warned me to call her behind her back, didn't even bother with a hello. She stopped right at the edge of our driveway, looking at my wife like she had just spotted a trespasser on private property. "Excuse me," she said in a tone that could cut glass, "are you aware that this property falls under HOA guidelines?" I told her yes, I was well aware, but that the cabin had been in my family long before the HOA was even formed, and our property was technically exempt from many of their rules. That didn't seem to satisfy her. She squinted at my wife like she was sizing up a threat. "And who exactly is this?" she asked, gesturing toward her. My wife, tired from a 12-hour flight, gave a polite smile and said, "I'm his wife." You'd think that would have ended it, but no. Sharon's lips tightened, and she immediately asked if my wife was registered with the HOA. I almost laughed. Registered? She's my wife. She lives here now. That's when Karen's whole posture stiffened. She pulled out her phone and muttered something about unapproved occupants. My wife and I exchanged a look, silently deciding not to feed the fire. But Karen wasn't going away quietly. 2 hours later, after we'd unpacked, we heard the sound of a car pulling up. Not a neighbor, not a delivery truck, 2 police cruisers. My wife sighed heavily, already guessing what this was about. I stepped outside to meet them, and sure enough, Sharon was standing nearby with her arms crossed, looking like she'd just summoned the cavalry. "Officers," she began in her overly sweet voice, "this man has allowed an unregistered person to take up residence here, and she was being aggressive with me earlier." My jaw almost hit the floor. Aggressive. My wife had barely spoken to her. The officers looked between us, clearly unsure why they had been called for something so petty. "Sir, ma'am, is there an issue here we should be aware of?" one of them asked. I was about to launch into an explanation when my wife calmly reached into her bag and pulled out her military ID. She handed it to the officer without a word. His expression shifted instantly, respect replacing suspicion. "Ma'am," he said, handing it back, "thank you for your service." I glanced at Karen, who had gone completely pale, like she'd just realized she'd picked the wrong fight. Karen opened and closed her mouth like she wanted to argue, but the sight of the officers treating my wife with that level of respect seemed to knock the wind out of her. My wife, for her part, stayed calm in that way only someone who's been through far more intense situations than an HOA busybody could manage. The officers asked a few more questions, clearly just to fulfill the call report, but their body language told me they thought this was a waste of time. I explained again that the cabin had been in my family long before the HOA was formed, that my wife and I were both legal residents, and that there was no reason for this call except personal grievance. One of the officers sighed, jotting something in his notebook, and asked Karen if she had any actual legal complaint. She shifted uncomfortably, muttered something about community safety, and avoided eye contact. My wife simply crossed her arms and waited. The silence stretched until it became awkward for everyone. Finally, the officer closed his notebook and said, "All right, folks, looks like there's no crime here. Let's all try to get along." The police left, and I thought, naively, that this would be the end of it. But people like Karen don't just back down. If anything, this incident seemed to light a fire under her. Over the next week, it felt like Karen was on some kind of personal mission to make our stay at the cabin as unpleasant as possible. I caught her parked just down the road more than once, pretending to check her phone but clearly keeping an eye on our driveway. She filed Maintenance violation, slips in my mailbox for ridiculous things, like the fact that our curtains were a different color on the inside than the outside, or that my truck had a speck of mud on the tire. One morning, I came outside to find a printed list of community guidelines taped to our front door, even though we weren't subject to most of them. My wife found the whole thing more amusing than infuriating, which I suppose was one of the benefits of her military training. When you've dealt with actual life or death stakes, while harassment barely registers on the stress scale. Still, she decided to fight pettiness with politeness. Every time Karen tried to corner her, my wife would flash a warm smile, thank her for her concern, and walk away before the woman could say more. It drove Karen insane. I could see it in the way her face twitched when she realized she wasn't getting the reaction she wanted. The real turning point came when Karen tried to rally other HOA members against us. She organized an emergency meeting at the community clubhouse, supposedly to address a breach of neighborhood security. A sympathetic neighbor tipped us off, so my wife decided to attend. She walked in wearing casual clothes, blending in, but the moment Karen saw her, you could practically see the steam coming out of her ears. Karen started her speech with vague warnings about outsiders moving into the neighborhood without proper vetting, claiming it could endanger the community's peaceful way of life. The insinuations were obvious. She was talking about my wife. After a few minutes of this, my wife calmly stood, waited for the murmurs to die down, and introduced herself. She explained she was an active duty service member, had just returned from deployment, and was here to spend time with her husband in a property that had been in his family for decades. Then she pulled her military ID from her pocket, held it up so everyone could see, and said, "I've spent years protecting the freedoms that allow communities like this to exist. I assure you, I'm not the threat here." The room went quiet, except for the sound of Karen's pride shattering into 1,000 pieces. For a moment, the silence was heavy enough to hear the hum of the air conditioner in the corner of the clubhouse. Karen's eyes darted around the room, looking for someone to back her up, but the effect of my wife's calm authority was undeniable. A few people even nodded in her direction, offering small smiles or murmured thanks. One older gentleman raised his hand and said, "If she served our country, she's welcome in my neighborhood anytime." That seemed to open the floodgates. Others spoke up, pointing out that my family's cabin had been here longer than the HOA itself and that it wasn't right to target someone based on hearsay. Karen's usual grip on the group was slipping, and you could see her struggling to regain it. She mumbled something about just following protocol, and making sure everyone feels safe, but it sounded hollow. My wife didn't need to say anything more. She simply sat back down, composed as ever, while Karen fumbled to wrap up the meeting that had clearly backfired on her. By the time we left, I noticed several neighbors approaching my wife to shake her hand and thank her for her service, gestures that made Karen shrink further into the background. The days following the meeting were almost eerie in their quietness. Karen's golf cart patrols became less frequent, and when she did pass our cabin, she avoided making eye contact. The ridiculous violation notices stopped arriving in our mailbox, and the flyers about community guidelines mysteriously disappeared from the bulletin board. It seemed the public embarrassment of the meeting had been enough to make her retreat, at least for now. My wife and I finally had the peaceful summer we'd envisioned, hiking in the mornings, reading on the porch in the afternoons, and sharing quiet dinners as the sun set behind the mountains. But I noticed something else, too. Neighbors who had previously kept their distance started to warm up to us. Some brought over fresh vegetables from their gardens, others invited us to small barbecues or fishing trips. It was clear that, in standing up to Karen's unfounded hostility, my wife had earned more than respect, she had earned trust. And in a small community like this, trust was worth its weight in gold. One afternoon, as we were stacking firewood for the coming fall, Karen surprised us by walking up the driveway. She didn't have her clipboard, and she wasn't wearing the tight, self-satisfied expression she usually carried. Instead, she looked hesitant, even nervous. She cleared her throat and said, "I wanted to apologize. I may have been overzealous in trying to enforce the rules." My wife didn't respond right away, letting the silence hang just long enough to make the moment sincere. Finally, she nodded and said, "Thank you for saying that." Karen shifted her weight from one foot to the other before adding, "I didn't realize." She trailed off, but it was clear she meant she hadn't realized who my wife was or what she'd done for the country. My wife gave her a small smile and said, "You don't need to know someone's background to treat them with respect. That should come first." It wasn't a dramatic reconciliation, but it was a start. Karen gave a quick nod, muttered another, "Sorry," and walked back down the road. After that, life settled into a rhythm that felt almost idyllic. The cabin was once again the sanctuary it had always been for me, and now it was for my wife, too. Every so often, we'd see Karen in passing, and while we'd never become close friends, she no longer interfered in our lives. I think she realized that her power only went as far as people allowed it to, and that underestimating someone, especially someone like my wife, could come back to haunt you. That summer taught me more than I expected about small-town politics, resilience, and the quiet strength that comes from not overreacting in the face of pettiness. My wife had handled the entire ordeal with the same poise she carried in uniform, proving that dignity and patience can sometimes be more powerful than anger. And as the first leaves began to turn gold in the early hints of autumn, I found myself grateful not just for the peace we'd reclaimed, but for the reminder that even the most stubborn Karen can be disarmed, not with shouting, but with unshakable grace and the truth.